So, spoiler warning for this video, but did the Fallout TV show confirm for 100% certain that it was absolutely Vault-Tec who started the Great War by dropping the bombs first? I've seen many articles come out and say that because of the Fallout TV show, and in particular episode 8, that finally the debate has been settled, it's been proven without a shadow of a doubt. It was definitely Vault-Tec who did it. It wasn't the US or China or another nation like Russia. It wasn't Pam. Heck, it wasn't even aliens. It was definitely Vault-Tec who did it, and episode 8 proves it. I'm here today to tell you that that is not confirmed by any means. Even given episode 8, even given the entirety of the Fallout TV show and all of those pre-war segments with Vault-Tec, it is very much still up in the air when it comes to who actually started the Great War by firing first. I'm going to go through episode 8, break down exactly what was said, what was shown, but importantly, I'm going to go back to the games because as much as this TV show is canon, Todd Howard has confirmed that, obviously the games are still canon as well, and we need to consider all available evidence when it comes to broaching this topic. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more Fallout content from me, please like, subscribe if you're new, with notifications if that's possible, but let's get right into the video. First up, let's begin with the pre-war segment in episode 8 of the show, where Vault-Tec is hosting a roundtable with a bunch of other big US corporations. Bud and Barb are there on behalf of Vault-Tec. Then we have Sinclair of Big Mountain, Robert House of Robco, Leon von Felden of West-Tec, Julia Masters of Repcon. Seemingly all the big players are there, and Vault-Tec is trying to convince all of them to buy into their Vault initiative. Initially, Bud says, "Our sales are fine. Sure, rumors of the peace negotiations have set us back a bit, but we're here to offer you an opportunity. We'd like to collaborate on some of our vaults." After some back and forth, Barb, after getting a message on her Pip-Boy from a shadowy figure of some sort, and trust me, we'll talk about him in a bit, tries to refocus the conversation and says we need to hedge our bets. Then we jump forward to after the Great War in Vault 31, where Norm is on the precipice of discovering the true purpose of Vaults 31, 32, and 33. Norm is speaking with the brain on a Roomba, who we know is Bud, and asks him, "So what's Vault 32 and 33? Just people to be controlled?" And Bud responds, "What? No. When you put it like that, it sounds downright morally questionable. They're our breeding pool, the ultimate expression of HR R&D, genetically selected to breed with my buds to create a class of super managers, people with positivity, people who make lemonade, people who will inherit the earth after we've wiped the surface clean." So this is the first piece of evidence which might suggest that Vault-Tec were the ones who dropped the first nuke and started the Great War. This is Bud, who worked for Vault-Tec prior to the Great War and technically still after the Great War, who has an intimate knowledge of Vault-Tec's plans and inner workings, saying that we wiped the surface clean. And the implication might be that we is referring to Vault-Tec. So in other words, we at Vault-Tec wiped the surface clean. Now this is a good argument. However, he of course doesn't actually say this. By saying we, he could have just been referring to we, the human race, in a broader, vaguer sense. After all, a lot of countries fired nukes, so this would make sense as well. Alternatively, he might have just believed that Vault-Tec started the Great War while he was busy transferring his brain over to the Roomba, but it's still possible that on that day, they didn't actually fire the first nuke. Also, by saying after we've wiped the surface clean, he could be speaking in the future tense, suggesting that sometime in the future, he and his buds are going to wipe the surface clean, such as by nuking settlements, which is what Hank did with Shady Sands. All I'm saying is that he might not have been referring to Vault-Tec allegedly firing first and starting the Great War. It's not definitive, so let's move on. Back in the pre-war segment, Robert House, forever skeptical, says it's a fun idea, there's a lot of earning potential with the end of the world, but we're talking about making a significant investment based on a hypothetical. How can you guarantee results? And Barb importantly responds by dropping the bomb ourselves. A nuclear event would be a tragedy, but also an opportunity. Perhaps the greatest opportunity in history, because when we are the only ones left, there will be no one to fight. A true monopoly. This is our chance to make war obsolete, because in our current societal configuration, which took shape without intentional guidance, we have friction, we have conflict, and we have war. And war, well, war never changes. So this is the second but biggest reason why people are saying that Vault-Tec absolutely did it. They are taking Barb's suggestion, and therefore Vault-Tec's suggestion, that we should drop the nukes first and start the Great War, as definitive proof of them actually going on later and doing just that. All in order to ensure that they secured their investment when it came to the vaults. And you know what? It makes sense. There is a very good reason why this has been such a prevailing fan theory for many years now. Vault-Tec spent so much money on the vaults, literally billions upon billions of dollars in just constructing them alone. And that's not even mentioning the money that would have went into R&D and staff and supplies and tech and the GEC. So much money was sunk into the vaults. And quite simply, they could not have afforded the Great War just not happening. If that occurred, all of those vaults would have been rendered completely useless, so they could say goodbye to their investment and, importantly, the control and monopoly they wanted after the Great War. So what do? Well, they come up with this idea, this contingency plan, if you will, of beginning the war by dropping the first nuke in order to ensure there is a nuclear catastrophe which people need to seek protection from. That way, their investment is secured and they can run all the experiments they want. And the show presents this moment so wonderfully, so masterfully, that I really want to believe that it's 100% true. However, again, I need to be the one that says it. The show only presents Vault-Tec as having the idea of dropping the first nuke and starting the Great War, not that they actually went on to do it. So it's a very strong bit of evidence to consider, but it's certainly not definitive. Now, some might argue, why would the showrunners go through all the effort of developing this plot point and storyline only for it to result in nothing, only for Vault-Tec to just have the idea of dropping the first nuke, but not actually doing so? The reason is that me, you, and everyone who's played Fallout, we get it, we understand Vault-Tec, we know about the true purpose of the vaults and all the crazy experiments they were running on people. However, do you know who doesn't have that knowledge? Everybody else watching the show, people who haven't played Fallout before and need to be shown how truly insane Vault-Tec was. So while they could have just said that Vault-Tec had the idea of running experiments on people to get the point across, to really run it home, they also insinuated that they would go as far as dropping the nuke themselves just to ensure their Vault initiative was safe. That plot point really emphasizes how depraved Vault-Tec was. So even if it turns out that Vault-Tec didn't actually fire first, that's okay. That doesn't make the storyline meaningless or useless. It still served its purpose. Viewers just needed to know the lengths that Vault-Tec would go to, which in my opinion, still happens whether or not they were actually the ones that fired the first nuke. Moreover, there's evidence in the show which suggests that Vault-Tec didn't know the bombs were going to be dropped on the date of the Great War. For instance, if Vault-Tec actually pulled the trigger, why did Barb, a high-ranking exec, let her daughter Janie be so far away from a vault in episode 1 of the show? Why was Janie at the birthday party with Coop? If Vault-Tec dropped the bomb, surely Barb would make the effort of ensuring Janie was much closer to a vault at the time in order to ensure she was protected. Now, of course, there is a chance that Vault-Tec still fired first and Barb simply didn't know. Remember, she only suggested the idea of dropping the first bomb after being prompted by the shadowy figure at the top of the room. This could suggest there was an inner cabal inside of Vault-Tec, and they were the ones who really controlled the show, including exactly when they would drop the nuke, and therefore they kept staff like Barb out of the loop. And yes, there is every chance this inner group was comprised of high-ranking members of the Enclave or even people like Dr. Stanislas Braun. However, I just don't know if this is convincing. Barb was a high-ranking exec at Vault-Tec. If there was anyone who would know when they were dropping the nuke, surely it would be her. She already knew of the plan and was the one presenting it at the important roundtable meeting. So why wouldn't she know of the timing? To me, that just doesn't make sense. I think that Janie being at the birthday more suggests that someone else pulled the trigger first and caught Vault-Tec off guard. Either way, it's still up in the air, and that's the whole point of this video. Now, for a moment, I want to take a step back and consider what Tim Kaine has said on the matter publicly. Tim Kaine, if you don't know, was one of the OG developers of Fallout at Interplay, and he has said that it was China who fired the first missile at the US because they found out the US was conducting illegal biotech research. Though, he doesn't technically say they actually started the Great War. His argument is more nuanced than that, and I'll explain why in a second. Now, before we consider Tim Kaine's statements, we need to remember that what he is saying technically isn't canon. Yes, he is an OG developer of Fallout, so what he says carries a hell of a lot of weight. We wouldn't be looking at his comments if that wasn't the case. However, because he never explicitly embedded this idea of China firing first into the original games because they found out the US was conducting illegal biotech and FEB research, it can't strictly be considered canon. Also, his theory doesn't necessarily rule out that was the only reason China fired first. For instance, like the show implies, Perhaps someone else like Vault-Tec attacked them initially, and that's also why they retaliated with missiles. So while Tim Kane's comments are very much helpful, they are not determinative. So at a Fallout Wiki roundtable in October 2022, Tim Kane was asked the question, so who started the Great War? USA, China, Vault-Tec, the Enclave? And Tim responds by saying, depends on your definition of start. China fired the first missile, but the US was doing illegal biotech research and kept doing it after being exposed. And then there's Canada. Now, I believe the Canada line was a bit of a joke, but he expressly says that it was China who fired the first nuke. Though he doesn't actually conclude that because of this, they definitely started the Great War. Again, his argument is more nuanced. Did China start the Great War because they fired first? Or did the US start it because they were experimenting with biotech and FEV in contravention of international and treaty law? An important question for sure. Then, in an interview with TK's Mantis in October 2023, he reiterates his earlier statement by saying, the reason we got nuked is bioweapons were illegal and somehow China found out we were doing FEV. And they were like, you have to stop it, and we went, okay. And all we did is move it. All we did was move it over. So again, from the perspective of one of the OG devs, it was China who fired first, but only because they found out the US was conducting illegal research. Now, before we look at the games, I do want us to consider something else. Back when Interplay still owned Fallout, they created Interplay Films in order to adapt several of their video games into movies, including Fallout. Before the release of Fallout 2, Brent Friedman was brought on board to write the script, and that film treatment was leaked on 19 March 2011 by Brent himself. In this document, the following is said. Our hero asks how the war started and is shocked to learn that it wasn't China or North Korea or India that fired the first strike. The first nuclear bomb was launched by the creator of the Vaults, a zealot businessman who wanted to fulfill his own prophecy of world annihilation. That first bomb triggered a panic chain reaction among other countries, leading to a 4-hour World War III. Now, of course, the movie was scrapped and cannot be considered canon by any means. However, it does raise an interesting point. Even though the script was written around the time of the original games, when an OG dev like Tim Kane believed China fired first, they were still tinkering around with the idea of Vault-Tec being the one responsible. In my opinion, this just emphasizes how they had the flexibility of such a storyline because the canon of the original games never necessarily ruled out such a scenario. If that had been the case, then Brent probably wouldn't have been allowed to come up with the Vault-Tec idea in the first place. But now, let's finally get to the games. The games, of course, will be one of our best guides when it comes to figuring out who dropped the first nuke and started the Great War. I have sources from most of the Fallout games for us to consider, including the originals. However, I need to stress the following before we look at them. None of these sources confirm as objective fact who actually fired first. None of them. It's not enough for one US character to say that he possibly saw Chinese missiles and therefore retaliated, because what if someone else fired at China before that? Likewise, it's not enough for a Chinese character to say he fired nukes because he was ordered to, because again, that doesn't confirm who actually went first. This is why it's been such a debate for so many years. So firstly, let's get this one out of the way. People keep arguing with me that the bomb in the middle of Megaton has a Vault-Tec symbol on it, and therefore it proves that Vault-Tec dropped nukes, possibly the very first nuke. However, this is absolutely not the Vault-Tec symbol. It is different. Yes, it's similar, but it's not the same. Plus, if Vault-Tec wanted to sabotage the US by firing the first nuke, why the hell would they put their logo on the bomb? Why risk somebody finding out it was them in the event the bomb went undetonated, like the one in Megaton? Also, why not just fire at China instead and instigate their response? It doesn't make sense whatsoever. Next up, we know that in the lore of Fallout, not all Vault-Tec vaults had finished construction. Specifically, neither Vault 88 or 114 had been built by the time the first nuke was dropped. Yes, there were other vaults which hadn't been finished too, but those were more about embezzled funds. When it comes to vaults that simply weren't finished due to time constraints, they were Vault 88 and 114. So, if Vault-Tec hadn't finished constructing all of their vaults, why on earth would they fire the nuke so early? Why wouldn't they just wait until all the vaults were finished and then launch the nuke after that? nuking early without the vaults being constructed would simply limit the potential economic value of the Vault initiative, which is exactly what they were worried about when suggesting they should drop the bomb in the first place. The only reason this would make sense to me is if they wanted to launch the nukes at a time when tensions were at their highest, such that they could avoid blame for being the one firing first, which unfortunately for them happened to be on a day when not all the vaults were finished. But to be honest, I'm not convinced by this argument, and I think it's more likely they were simply beaten to the punch. Additionally, we also know that getting into the vaults was a complete scramble, not just for Vault inhabitants, but also for Vault-Tec staff. For instance, at the beginning of Fallout 4, the last group of inhabitants just barely made it into Vault 111 when the nuke was dropped. Several terminal entries confirm this too. The security log on October 23, 2077 states, "God, it finally happened. The world's over. Barely got all the residents inside. Not everyone made it." Then the overseer's log on the same day states, "It's happened. We were lucky that most of the staff was nearby when the early warning came through. We had less notice than expected, but only Nordhagen was missing when we sealed the entrance." So again, if it really was Vault-Tec who fired the first nuke, why wouldn't they give their staff more time to prepare? Why go through the effort of developing the vaults for years, spending billions of dollars on construction and recruiting staff, only just to suddenly drop the bomb and prevent all staff from making it in time? Wouldn't that just potentially undermine the integrity of the vaults, especially including the scientific experiments? Now, some might argue, hold on, didn't the overseer say that they had notice of the nukes? Wouldn't that mean they were told by higher-ups in Vault-Tec that they were launching on that day? Well, no, not necessarily. We know the US had the ability to detect nukes and missiles before they actually landed, and then signal that fact to the wider populace. So, they could have just been told in that manner. Furthermore, let's say Vault-Tec were still planning to launch a nuke. Perhaps the overseer saying they had less notice than expected again indicates somebody else beat them to the punch. Because if Vault-Tec were the ones who pulled the trigger first, then staff members probably would have received the longer expected notice. Next up, we need to consider Fallout 2. In that game, the player can speak to President Dick Richardson, who is the leader of the Enclave on their offshore oil rig in 2242. In that conversation, the president says, "We were winning too, and then those damn Reds launched everything they had. We barely got our birds up." The player responds, "Doesn't seem as though it helped us much." And the president says, "Well, no it didn't, but at the least it knocked the damn Red menace back into the Stone Age." So here we have a character in one of the OG Fallout games stating that it was the Reds, as in the Chinese, who launched all their nukes and the US retaliated just in time. Now again, this doesn't confirm it was definitely China who fired first. It's entirely possible that something or someone else fired at China beforehand and they only launched their missiles afterwards in response. Also, how do we know the president is telling the truth? The Enclave is notorious for lying or blurring the truth, so there is every chance he is just not being honest in this conversation. However, this is not the only evidence in the games which suggests that China at least fired before the US did, even if that wasn't necessarily first before someone like Vault-Tec. For instance, in the Fallout New Vegas terminal entries at Black Mountain, log 672 states, "We've been picking up a lot of activity from China's satellite network. The tension is pretty high around here. Frank's been talking about securing a place in one of those vaults for himself and his family, and when he didn't show up to work yesterday, I think we all knew where he went." And then log 674 follows up by saying, "Oh my god, it's actually happening. We have reading across the board of launches happening everywhere. They must have thrown everything they had, and it looks like we didn't hold back either. The computer says we have 2 minutes until the first missile drops." Additionally, in Fallout 4, the switchboard terminal entry DEFCON status 2077 mentions that USAF has eyes on squadron of aeroplanes, possibly Chinese, at high altitude off Bering Strait, followed by confirmation of strikes in Pennsylvania and New York. Furthermore, there is also the Yonsei ballistic missile submarine, commanded by Captain Zhao, who is now a ghoul. Zhao states, 200 years ago, I launched all of the Yongsei's high-yield nuclear missiles, as ordered. For 200 years, I've lived with that guilt, that shame, so much fire. So, at the very least, there might be enough evidence to suggest that China likely fired before the US on the date of the Great War. However, again, who's to say that somebody or something didn't launch a nuke at China beforehand? Just because China likely fired before the US, that doesn't necessarily mean they were first overall and actually caused the Great War. Somebody else, like Vault-Tec or possibly aliens, could have fired at China first, which caused them to retaliate. And no, that's not a joke. There is actually lore in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta DLC, which suggests that aliens might have been the ones responsible for firing first. Specifically, in Alien Captive Recorded Log 17, you can hear a bunch of babble from an alien who is interrogating somebody. Although there is no audio of the person's response, in the game files, it is revealed they are saying the following. We have 38 ICBMs always on alert and ready to fire when the word is passed down from the White House. The codes to activate the launch sequences are, no, I can't let you. Get out of my mind. The codes. No, I can't betray. My head. I can't. Won't. So, my terrible voice acting aside, it's possible the aliens are interrogating US military personnel in order to obtain their nuclear launch codes. However, it's of course not confirmed whether the aliens were actually successful in getting those codes. The person seems to resist their mind control. Plus, even if they did, who is to say they actually were the ones who launched the nuke first and caused the Great War? And since the person's audio wasn't actually audible, do we consider this as canon or cut content? And finally, some people have made the suggestion that Pam in Fallout 4 was responsible for the Great War. Pam was designed by the US government to predict the likelihood of a nuclear strike. In her dialogue, she mentions how she doesn't like too many unknown variables. So some have come up with a theory that Pam fed the US false information about the impending nuclear strikes, causing them to fire at China. However, nothing in her dialogue actually suggests this whatsoever. It's a completely random theory, so I thought I'd just mention it here. So as you can see, there are several pieces of lore which touch on the topic of who started the Great War by firing the first nuke. And yes, even after the Fallout TV show, it is still very much in doubt. We don't know for 100% certain whether it was actually Vault-Tec who did it, or indeed anything or anyone else. And you know what? That is deliberate. This is an intentionally vague plot device designed to get us constantly speculating and talking about the franchise. And because of that, we may never really know who actually started the Great War in Fallout. So if you enjoyed this video, again, please like, subscribe if you're new, consider supporting me on Patreon, and until next time, this has been the Lone Vault Wanderer. Please take care of yourselves, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.